All right, so later on we're going to have a show on Lagba. Right now we're going to finish or continue with the whole thing about Zionism and if it's allowed or not. Okay, so today we're going to learn in depth about the fact that if I make an oath and you break it, I'm also absolved from the oath. So I found the book. I thought I lost it, and then I actually refound it. So we talked about this tons, and we're going to talk about it again. But you remember the Rebbe of Satmar, who's the one who claims you have to give up your life rather than make Aliyah. It's him on the right. So this is his book, V'yol Moshe. I somehow picked it up. Good to know what the other half say. And this is the very anti-Zionist book, which I don't know, I can't remember how. I think someone's giving away books, to be honest. Before I was on Shlichut, because this is my old phone number. Yes, you may. So, I've got a few other books I want to share with you as well.
This is from the Satmar Rebbe.
This is from the Satmar Rebbe, yeah. So, it's a very long book. It's very in depth. I'm not saying he doesn't know what he's talking about. He is a Talmud Chacham.
Written in Rashi's language.
Yeah, Rashi's alphabet. He's a Talmud Chacham. I just disagree with him. Okay.
Can you read this?
What? Rashi's alphabet.
Just do it off by heart and you'll understand.
Yeah, because I've had a lot of. I mean, you'd be able to within a month of reading it. You just need to learn the alphabet. Half the letters are the same. Okay. All right. So the Rabbi Satmar says this: there are heretics that say that since the nations of the world did not keep their oath, then we, God forbid, have permission to transgress our oaths, since they all have been absolved through the non-Jews' transgressions. Okay. Says the people who think that when you break an oath, you're absolved from the other oaths. They are what? Heretics. How do you say heretics in Hebrew?
Kufa.
That's in Arabic. Koifer. Okay, someone who breaks the who disagrees with the Torah. To say that those are interdependent should be considered futilities of futilities. Hevel havalim. He thinks it's completely and utterly worthless opinion. Okay. Now, what's the problem with this? That he said this between 1887 and 1979, which means that he's probably referring this to other Zionists who are around, who were saying that, yeah, it does apply to this. And when you break the oath, you absolve from all the other oaths. Okay? What's the challenge? That there are people before him who says otherwise. So there's a famous area famous for Jewish history, called Galicia, which now is part of which is an area of western Ukraine and eastern Poland. Now it's split into two. And there was a rabbi called Rabbi Shlomo Kruger who died in 1869. So in 1845, I'm sorry, he was asked to be a rabbi in Brazen, and he didn't listen to his own community's request in Brody. You may know people with the last name Brody. It's quite a common name. So they're probably from this town. Yeah. Okay.
My rabbi is called Brody.
So he's probably from this town. There was a big community. Okay. So Brody. Why am I saying it? So his community in Brody asked him to remain. He refused. After that, he got to Brazen, and he became ill with typhus. And the doctors basically gave up and saying he was about to die. He recovered, and he began to recover, and he accepted upon himself that this happened because he abandoned his community, and he promised that once he would recover, he would return to be a rabbi of Brody. In between him leaving Brody and becoming a rabbi in Brazen and getting sick, they'd appointed a new rabbi. So he didn't switch to a new rabbi, he just went back to Brody and stayed there, and somehow made a living without being a rabbi. Okay, so he writes in his Haggadah. He has a Haggadah on the Pesach Haggadah. Yeah, he has a parish. If the king or the government transgress the oath and pursue and enslave the nation of Israel, then Israel is permitted to transgress their oath also. He has said this before the Holocaust. He's saying that if the oaths are broken, if the non-Jews punish us too much, pursue and enslave us, then we are allowed to break the oath of rebelling against them and making aliyah. Okay, now, no, when did we didn't rebel against them when we made aliyah. Against the British maybe, but before that we didn't. Okay, so now Rav Yor, where's the book on? Rav Yor in Yor Moshe is going to have to answer this. He knows about this written already. Okay, Rabbi Yor Teitelbaum was born 8 years, after Rav Shlomo Kruger passed away. And he knew about what Rav Shlomo Kruger said, so he has to relate to it. And the truth, the words of Rav Shlomo Kruger were only written as a drush. What's a drush? A drusha? What's a drusha?
No, it's like a thought.
A thought. Oh, it's a nice drush. It's a nice idea. They didn't mean it literally. The way he's dealing with a disproof against him is, no, he didn't mean it when he said it. Come on. It was homiletic. It wasn't real. As is the way of all preachers who sharpen the interpretations through the telling of stories. Words written in this manner are not meant to be halach at all. And the homily can be learned, yet no answer needs to be given. Meaning, and you don't need to learn anything from it. This is literally ignoring the words of Shlomo Kruger. Instead of relating to them seriously, he's literally ignoring it and saying he didn't mean it. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about this guy. Okay, if you want to just look at the screen, I don't want to show it down because I don't see you lying down. Okay, see the guy with the top hat?
Yeah. Abraham Lincoln.
What?
Abraham Lincoln.
It's not Abraham Lincoln, no. His name is Rav Menachem Kasher. He was a Gur Chassid, but even though Gur weren't Zionist, he was incredibly Zionist. He wrote 2 very famous books. Well, not very famous book. Hatkufa Gdola, the great period of time, which is all about Zionism.
Era.
Yeah, very good, thank you. The great era, thank you.
You're welcome.
And he wrote another book called, I should have brought that out as well, called Chumash Torah Shlema, which basically brings every single midrash you can find on every single pasuk, and explains it in this and the other. It was never finished before he passed away. In the Tekufa Gdola, he also stuck in this book at the back, which is Kol HaTorah, which is all about the Gra Zionism. And some people claim this is a fake. Most people don't, and they think the Gra is incredibly Zionist. It talks about the importance of return to the land and how you bring the redemption. The way you bring the redemption is by learning Kabbalah and living in Israel, basically. Okay, that's how you bring redemption. So, Rav Menachem Kasher was a Gur Chassid. He he was almost 100 when he died. Which is quite crazy back in the day. He was 87, which is still very old. He died in 1983, 4 years before I was born. And he, even though he was a Chassid and brought the Rebbe of Gur to Israel, he managed to bring him to Israel, he continued being very, very Zionist. He went to America to work on this book, and then he came back. He wrote this. Okay, if we just remember. Firstly, the Satmar says, anyone who says they're because they're interdependent, if they break it, it goes away, he calls them a heretic. Then we said the Rav Shlomo Kruger says, well, that is the halacha. Then we said the Rebbe Satmar says on that, well, he didn't really mean it. It's just a teaching which he didn't really mean. Rav Menachem Kasher is like, you guys have to it's like a drop the mic moment when he says what he says back, okay? This is what he says back to the Rebbe Satmar who said that about Rav Shlomo Kruger. He says, and what was written by the Rebbe of Satmar to answer the opinion of Rabbi Shlomo Kruger by saying that his words were merely a drasha, a homiletic, maybe themselves be used on most of the words written in his own book. Drop the mic. Okay, meaning the Rebbe of Satmar, you tried to say that what Rabbi Shlomo Kruger said about the oaths being independent wasn't meant to be literal. Well, you know what? That's going to be said about the whole book. Don't take anything of what he wrote literally. That's what he says. Okay.
Yeah, that was the Satmar.
I mean, he called people heretics and fools. In the last 2 shirim, he's called people heretics and fools. Because he believed he was right. Okay. So those who are Sephardi here, Yosef, you're going to be happy with learning about our first Sephardi person today, and we're going to have another Sephardi person later. So the Shulchan Aruch, Yosef Cairo. I had to write down all the countries he was in because he had quite a crazy. He could have logged into these websites and counted all the countries he was in, and the percentages of the world. I don't know if you've done that before. There's like a website where you can count how much you've been in of the world. You've done it before?
Wait, what? Okay. What?
Percentage of the world you've been in. What's annoying is it divides America into states as opposed to you've been to America and it counts all of them. It's a bit cheeky. In any case, so he was born in Spain. He was born 4 years, I think, before the Spanish Inquisition. Oh yeah, 1488. They ran away to Portugal, which the Inquisition hadn't reached yet. But then there they ran away to Turkey, to Kushta, and then they ran away to Bulgaria. Not ran away. He became a rabbi in Bulgaria, and then he became a rabbi he moved to Israel and was a rabbi there. He received the first person to receive real smicha from Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, and this was seen as a step by many Kabbalists as integral to the bringing of the Mashiach. So basically, anyone today who says they have smicha doesn't have real smicha. Real smicha was when Moshe Rabbeinu would place his hands on your head and give you smicha, and then whoever of them receives smicha could be so much other people. There's no test. It was to do with the righteous person giving smicha to another righteous person. That died out. Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, who was alive in the time of the Shulchan Aruch, the Yosef Cairo, said we can renew it. He learned that out from the Rambam, and he renewed smicha. And 25 of the greatest rabbis Sfat at that time gave him a smicha, and he then was able to give other people the real smicha. The rabbis of Yerushalayim disagreed, and there was big machloket. One of the people who gave smicha to was Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who gave it to the Arizal, and eventually he gave it to Rav Moshe Elshich. So Rav Chaim Vital, and Rav Chaim Vital gave it to Rav Moshe Elshich. However, it died out in the 1700s. So since then, even though it also wasn't recognized by most rabbis, but it was seen as an integral part to bring back Mashiach.
What if every Jew put their hands on one Jew's head? And does that count as smicha?
According to Rambam, if the rabbis, the greatest rabbis of the generation involved them, yes.
Well, let's say every Jew.
Doesn't matter. Now, what's cool is that crazy story is that the Talmudei Agra tried to get the Ethiopians to return smicha. They heard rumors, which ended up being incorrect. I've said this story before, I think. Yeah. They heard that the Ethiopians still had smicha. So they asked the Ethiopians to send someone with smicha to Tzfat to renew smicha in Eretz Israel, because once you have smicha in Eretz Israel, the Mashiach can come. They started writing back and forward, and then they came to a realization that the people in Ethiopia didn't have Torah Sheba'al Peh, and they were very far from having real smicha. And then, so realizing their mistake, they at least offered to teach the Ethiopians, Jewish Ethiopians, oral Torah. And to this, they said, send us some of your people to Israel and we'll teach you the real Torah. And then they replied saying, you come to Ethiopia and we'll teach you the real Torah. Another drop the mic moment. In the end, they kind of lost contact, and it took another 200 years until we were back in contact with them. Okay, so what does the Shulchan Aruch says? He says, two people that make an oath, and one of those who took the oath broke his oath. The second may break his oath with no requirement to annul the original oath. This is in a normal situation. Me and Avadi make an oath. We discussed this 2 days ago. And I break it. He's allowed to break his as well. He's not a chilul Hashem. It's not a chilul of the oath. He's completely allowed to. Now, Rabbi Menachem Kasher, in this huge book called Hatkufa Gdola, brings an idea in the name of Rav Hillel Kolomayer, who died in 1891, also from Eastern Europe. Surprise, surprise. With that kind of name. 1 second. He says this. It is known that Hashem made 3 oaths. One of those oaths was administered to the leaders of the nations, so as not to enslave Israel oppressively, and to allow them to dwell in the lands under their protection, which he says is Listofef B'Tzilam. Yosef, you yesterday asked me, Why did all the Jews end up in Poland? Jews have been running from country to country, east. Why did they get to Russia of all places?
Why did they get?
Because they hadn't yet been there.
Why did they try to get as far away as they go? Did they go to Patagonia?
Not that I know. That was the Welsh and the Italians and all these different places.
But like gypsies.
No. Gypsies don't always run away. Gypsies are traveling people because that's their culture. We're not traveling people because that's the culture. We run away from things. We're literally always running away. And also, the more west you go, you also go further away. I'm not sure if Russia is geographically further away from Israel. It might be closer to Israel. Then you get closer to the what's it called?
Meridian?
What's it called? Longitude and latitude?
The equator?
No. Get closer to them in the west-east axis. Whatever it's called. Okay? And the above ruling of the Shulchan Aruch in a case of two people that made the oath between them, and one of those who swore broke his oath, there we learn that the second oath taker may also break his oath. And so too here. If the king and the government transgress the oath and pursue and oppress the Jewish people, it's surely permitted for the Jewish people to transgress their oath also. This is called self-protection, self-preservation. When it's meaning, the Rebbe Satmar says that if we're in the middle of a pogrom, we still can't give up our lives. We have to give up our lives rather than make aliyah.
Yeah.
Okay. You can think it is, but if you don't accept this halakha, I don't know how you can know that.
So you're like this.
We learn in the Midrash, if you break these oaths, God will skin you alive like deer. Right?
So don't we have to, we have an obligation to pass down a sword. How can we allow ourselves to die?
That's not.
Well, if our only way to escape Israel and survive it, and we can still pass down the sword.
That's obviously not clear because we're not allowed to kill someone to preserve the sword. There are some things we have to give up our lives for, rather than pass over the sword.
Is that part of being a Jew, passing down the...
Yeah, fair, but it's not one of the 13 principles of faith. It's not something you have to die for.
So according to this, we would all have to die in the Holocaust instead of moving to Israel?
Yeah, fair, yes.
So all of Judaism...
Well, firstly, not all the Jews were in Europe.
But let's say it spread, because it was spreading to the Middle East, and they don't have plans.
He believed that you weren't allowed to make mass aliyah, and it's better to die than do so, yes.
That's horrible.
Okay.
The whole Jewish
okay, all right, so you tell me, can you understand why a secular person would say the thing about you if someone to tell them it's better for all the Jews to die than to worship idols? You can understand why someone would be bothered by that, right? If all the Jewish people are told worship idols, it is better for us to die than to worship idols. Judaism would cease to exist, okay? And halakha would be doing the right thing, okay?
But
secular person would find that disgusting. Just bow for a second, pretend to do it, move on.
But there's some people say you should do that.
No one says you should do that.
Why? If they're telling you, if someone points you on to and say Hashem's not real, and you say it, just so you could go from
No, you're not allowed to.
I've heard you're
you're not.
Yeah, I've heard you're allowed to.
The Moranos were wrong. Baruch Hashem, many of them came back. The Moranos who converted Catholicism and pretended and were still trying to keep kosher at home and lighting Shabbat candles at home, but went to church on Sundays to play the fact that they were Catholic. They were wrong. I don't know if I passed the test. I don't know if I'd be prepared to burn at the stake instead of converting, but they were wrong with what they did.
The cross.
Rav Kasher continues, okay? And today, so Rav Hillel Kolomer died in 1891. Rav Kasher died 40 years after the Holocaust. He says this, and today we see after the Holocaust, the Shoah, that the blood of Israel was spilled like water and all the nations of the world stood aside. There are some exceptions. Philippines let in Jews. Japan letting the Jews into Shanghai. The Mir Yeshiva. There were some very, very small examples, and there were individuals as well. What?
I think Shanghai is China, no?
Yeah, but Japan was in control of it.
Okay.
And the nations of the world were silent and prevented our Jewish brethren from fleeing, finding shelter in the country with no exceptions. Right? Roosevelt, FDR was terrible for the Jews. When he was
FDR knew about Auschwitz and your refused to do anything about it.
Pardon?
FDR knew about Auschwitz and you refused to do anything about it.
Where's the furthest what?
You said we went east or something.
I mean, in Europe, we went east.
So where's the private country that people go?
mean, Uzbekistan. But that's also because the Soviets sent them there. Uzbekistan had Sephardi communities, and then one of my friends, Gedalia Shamas, he was up with me on Shtichut in Chicago. He's from Uzbekistan originally, and they were sent east. I mean, I don't know if you know, historically, Stalin was about to wipe out the Jews, and then he died. It was planned for him to wipe out the Jews. In particular, the gates of the land of Israel were closed, right? The British closed the gates of the land of Israel, and Jews died. And boats were sunk with many Jews aboard who wanted merely to find quiet in the land of Israel. As such, it's clear as day for all those that wish to admit there is no place for the older oaths, and therefore they have all been absolved. Okay? At the end of the day, I'm not going to call it what you did, Ephraim, but he is basically saying that it is ridiculous to say it, but not because he's ignoring the Gemara, because he's relating the Gemara and saying the Gemara is clear. Once they break their oaths, which they've been doing for hundreds of years, Khmelnytsky massacre, the Shoah, however, is the best example of them breaking the deal. When first time ever we had a real working international organization, League of Nations, where everyone was in touch with each other and everyone ignored it. Everyone turned a blind eye and we're okay with it. Okay, so that's the second answer we saw. So we had first yesterday we learned. So today we learned about them being. What did we learn yesterday? I've forgotten the first thing we learned yesterday. Yesterday we learned that, and remember,
What?
the reason we said yesterday we don't have to keep them was because.
They were broken first.
Well, that's today. 1 second. So yesterday we learned about that when we have permission. When we have permission, we're allowed to break them. When the nations allow it, then it's not called breaking anymore. Now we just learned that they're interdependent, and now we're going to learn, and this is the biggest challenge against the Rebbe of Satmar. What are Hasidim famous for learning?
Tomorrow.
No.
How to become.
No, die.
How to like.
What's Hasid? What is so unique about Hasidut?
It's more of a happy. What do you call it?
They're finding a personal connection to us.
Mysticism, right? Through mysticism, finding a personal connection. What is the biggest source of mysticism? The biggest book which is known for mysticism?
Kabbalah.
Kabbalah is mysticism. Which book? Famous one? The Zohar. Who wrote the Zohar? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, like woman, right? Okay, so we're going to learn now a little bit from the Zohar, yeah? We will after, okay. All of you, so it says in Eicha, all of you who pass along the road, let it not happen to you. Behold and see, if there is any pain like my pain, which has been dealt to me, with which the Lord saddened me on the day of his fierce anger. How long is the day?
24 hours. According to the real time. About 25 hours.
Okay. How long is God's anger? It says God was angry for a day. How long is a day for God?
1,000 years.
Why?
Because that's what he says. He's gonna take 6 days. Gave his 1 day of his life to.
I'm not sure about, but
No, he got 6 days and 70 Shabbat.
right. So the 6,000 years, 7,000 years of the world are compared to the 7 days of creation, including Shabbat. Okay. So the Eicha Rabbah, which is the Midrash says, which the Lord saddened me on the day of his fierce anger. Rabbi Acha would say, God's fierce anger lasted 1 day, and how we repented, the anger would have ended during that very same day. Had we done tshuva on the day which Kodesh Baruch Hu destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, he would have stopped it from continuing, and we would have all returned, and it wouldn't have continued. But we didn't. We continued praying to God instead of praying to him. Okay, so the Rashbi, right? Rashbi, how long ago was the Rashbi? How long? 200? Rashbi's from the Gemara. How long ago? He's one of the Tanai. More than 1,000.
1,500.
More than 1,000. Well, how long?
1,500.
More? Alright, I'll just 1,800. Okay? He was a student of who? Who was his rabbi? Famously his rabbi? That's him himself. He can't be his own. Rabbi Akiva, right? Rabbi Akiva's 14,000 Talmidim died. 14,000 pairs. And he then went to the south and established 4 new Talmidim.
Killed Rabbi Akiva's Jews.
It's a machloket whether it was an illness or it was in the war of Bar Kokhba against the Romans. Both make sense. Okay. He doesn't need to help them if they deserve it. Okay. So the Zohar says this.
What was the reason they died was because it was like going around?
Yeah, Sinachin.
Right.
It is learned that we shall be enslaved in exile until the end of that day of the rule of the nations. As Rabbi Yitzchak taught, the rule of the nations is limited to 1,000 years. How long is the day of anger?
1,000 days.
1,000 years.
Yes.
When was the Beit Mikdash destroyed? The second?
2,000 years ago. 2 days ago.
What?
2 days ago. 2,000 years ago.
I thought you said days.
I did. 2 days ago.
Oh, very good. Okay, good. Okay, so 2,000 years ago, but yeah, give or take a little bit. Okay. Okay. 1 second. So Rav Chaim Vital, another Sephardi rabbi, was one of the many Talmidim of the Arizal. After the Arizal passed away, he became the rabbi of many of them and asked them all to hand over their writings from the Arizal and asked them to promise never to print anything of their own. And he then compiled all of the Arizal's works, which most of them weren't written down. The Arizal died at the age of 40 something, maybe even a bit younger. And Rav Chaim Vital lived longer than that. He lived for 82 years until 1620. He was Rav in Sfat and then moved to Egypt and then to Damascus and then to Israel and then to Damascus. All over.
Why would he do
I know. There's a big community of Jews and stuff.
Who's that?
The great oath was sworn by the nation of Israel to God against awakening the redemption until the love our nations expresses to God we want and desire by Hashem. And as Chazal already stated, the oath is limited to 1,000 years. The involuntary exile of Israel will last only 1 day. Kabbalah says that the year of the oath only lasts for 1,000 years. Now, if you go from Shlomo Melech's time, that ended 100,000 years ago. If you go from the Churban Abayit, that ended around the year 1,000. We're talking about 900, more than 900 years where the oath isn't relevant anymore. So the big question is, why doesn't Rabbi Satmar deal with this and pick it up on this? I don't know. But the Rav Chaim Vital explicitly says it lasts only for 1,000 years. We're going to probably only do one more shir on this tomorrow and give the last few reasons for why we don't have to keep by it. We see it again and again and again. So Vadir, even though I said it wasn't the reason we learned yesterday, you are right. The first reason we learned is just it's very, very contradictory, all the things. Yes, no, what's the reason? Don't we? There's tons of different readings of what the oaths are. That was the first thing we said. Then we said once the nations give permission, then we're not bound by it. Then we said if they're interdependent and they've surely broken it. No one can say we haven't suffered enough in this Galut.
We have.
That's one of the most amazing miracles of Jewish people, that we've actually survived all of this. With all the other nations who've given us Sarot have disappeared. Even if you take Britain, obviously Britain hasn't disappeared, but it's nothing like it used to be.
Well, yeah, sure.
Britain used to be a world empire. They're still one of the top 10, but not a world empire. Russia. Who cares about Russia? I mean, I know they've got nuclear weapons. I know this. And Russia gave us all the trouble during the Soviet Empire. Right? They don't have an empire anymore.
Treating like Israel.
He has good relations with Bibi, but he also loves Syria. He's a very complicated thing. Okay, in any case, so we've seen, and we're going to probably end this tomorrow, the last year on this idea of why we don't have to keep the oath. It's important to note that the Haredim take these oaths very, very seriously, even though they're not written down in any halachic source. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't write them down. None of the Rishonim write them down as halacha, but they still take them very, very, very seriously.
Extremely seriously.
How do I stop it?